Good morning. It is Thursday, August the 31st, 2023. I'm Scott Collins. Um, this is my fourth blog since starting, and I'm just going to kind of talk off the top of my head today. To answer a question that one of my viewers had, a deist is someone who believes that God created, or the deity created the universe and the world, kind of like a clock. Uh, the Creator established all of the physical laws and then kind of allowed the mechanism to run on its own. It's an idea of a Creator who is not really engaged, particularly, in what has been created. But again, like a clock, is sort of allowing the mechanisms of space, time, and physics and nature to kind of work their own way out. Um, what I really like to talk about are things that are just kind of uh, in the realm of foreign policy, things that just have really bothered me, and I just can't get them off of my chest. Um, the founding fathers who established this country established a foreign policy of respecting the sovereignty of other countries, even smaller and defenseless ones, because they had won a war from independence and they wanted their sovereignty respected and they wanted to respect the sovereignty of other countries. And the famous Monroe Doctrine stated that the United States was going to resist any interference in the Western Hemisphere in countries that had already been established. The United States was not going to involve itself in revolutions. But once a government had been instituted, the United States was going to respect that and was going to insist that other countries, such as England or Spain, or whoever, who came into our hemisphere, also respected it, or the United States would intervene. So, it had to do with our sphere of influence. It had to do with the fact that also that the United States uh, would never interfere in the affairs of other countries unless American lives or American interests were directly at stake. There were many back in the 18th century who tried to put pressure on George Washington and the early colonial government to become involved with the French Revolution and other revolutions that were going on in Europe. And they resisted that because they knew that that the United States could commit itself indefinitely, and we're not always sure whether we're siding with the right parties. Now, the United States has intervened, like the pirates, the Muslim pirates off of coast of Africa, of Tripoli, that were raiding American ships. That was a direct threat to American interests. Or the French and then the English, who were forcibly conscripting uh, Americans into their armed forces. And so, we ended up having a trouble with France. And we also ended up with the War of 1812 against England because of this, even though we were a fledgling power. And then in the late 19th century, um, we began to embark on a more imperialistic course. Interestingly enough, John Quincy Adams, who was the Secretary of State under James Monroe, was the one who actually came up with the Monroe Doctrine. And one of the great statements that John Quincy Adams made was that it was not the mission of the United States to slay every monster in the world. Interesting, isn't it? Because one begins to think that is what has become the foreign policy of the United States. The United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries kind of strayed away from the vision of the founders into kind of imperialistic territory. We overthrew a government in Hawaii. We overthrew a government in the Philippines. Um, we overthrew Spanish rule in Cuba, and Cuba was under American control for a time. And there was this sense that the United States should use its power, newfound power, to broaden its sphere of influence in the world. Then World War I came, and many Americans were opposed to the United States' involvement in a foreign affair. And Woodrow Wilson, in his second campaign, promised that he would keep the United States out of the war. And within a month after making that promise, got the United States into World War I. After World War I, Harding and Coolidge kind of resisted getting the country involved in foreign affairs, although they negotiated an end and got the country out of the League of Nations, which was kind of the forerunner of the United Nations. And then we were drawn into World War II, although we were attacked, and there were reasons that we had a fear of the Axis powers. They were committing atrocities. They were threatening China, Europe. So we realized we didn't want to become increasingly isolated in a world that was run by the Axis powers. Needless to say, FDR used World War II as an opportunity to strip a whole group of people, the Japanese, of their due process rights and forcibly intern them in camps. Some of them proved their patriotism by still enlisting in the armed forces and fighting in Europe. But often war, as even in the Civil War, is used as a pretext for suspending certain rights like habeas corpus. And in the case of World War II, the right to forcibly intern a group of people whose loyalty is under question. After World War II, we had three choices we could, in relation to communism, because after the close of World War II, the communist powers had swept in and kind of taken control of half of Europe, half of Germany, and half of Berlin. And so we had three choices. Do we just stay out of that? Do we work to roll back communism? Or do we do what is called containment? George Kennan gave a famous telegram where he said the containment of communism was probably the best policy of the United States, and it's the one that we followed. And what gave that policy teeth was the Korean War. And so we went up against Korea, ended up provoking China's involvement, and that resulted in the deaths of many American soldiers. And thanks to that, we're still there at the demilitarized zone, although South Korea is a thriving country, and there is that accomplishment. But after the Second World War, we started to establish a whole apparatus of intelligence, like the CIA and different means to try to counter Soviet intelligence and insinuate our influence throughout the world. And we did this in not the best ways. We basically overthrew a democratically elected leader in Iran in 1953 and put in the Shah. Now, the Shah was more like you call an enlightened despot, but the reality is many people knew that he was there because of the United States. Well, that came back to haunt us, about 26 years later, in a little situation that we know as the Iran hostage crisis. For 444 days, we had Americans held up in the American embassy. The American embassy was invaded, which was really almost an act tantamount to war, but somehow we managed to negotiate our way out of it. And I'll give Jimmy Carter credit for that one, and Reagan's election. We had the war in Vietnam, but that ultimately failed. Um, we tried to put in a puppet government named Diem, who ended up getting overthrown. Um, and then having to get the people that were loyal to us out of the country. Um, we tried to change Afghanistan and Iraq, and out of Iraq we got ISIS. And when we left Afghanistan and the fiasco of our exodus, the Taliban was stronger than ever, and uh, Afghanistan ended up getting billions of dollars in equipment, which probably also went to China. Since the end of the Cold War, we have pushed NATO farther and farther east, despite the fact that Secretary of State James Baker said to Gorbachev after the reunification of Germany that we would not try to aggressively push NATO into the former Warsaw Pact or Eastern countries, but we did, all the way right up to Russia's borders. Now in the Ukraine. And it has been said that we have forcibly overthrew a legitimately elected government there in order to help Zelensky come to power. And it begs a question. At what point are we going to move away from imperialism, from covert actions in countries, covert involvement in countries, and overt involvement, and containment policies post World War II, post Soviet Union, and start to reflect on the foreign policy positions of the founding fathers of the United States. When the United States was formed, Great Britain was the primary power in the world, what you might call the global hegemony. And we hear a lot about that these days. Many want the United States to remain the global hegemony. But is that what we need to be doing? Or do we need to concern ourselves with the well-being of the United States? Thanks to the war, we have pushed Russia and China closer together. And they're forming a group called BRICS, which could create an alternative currency to the dollar, because the dollar has been the global standard since the end of the Second World War. Contrary to the advice of John Quincy Adams, we still think it's the mission of the United States to slay monsters, but is it? Or is it to be an example to the world of freedom and democracy in action and inspire others to do the same? I remember back in 1989, during the Tiananmen Square massacre, when the Chinese were standing in front of tanks with the Statue of Liberty. The Bush administration, the first Bush administration, was conspicuously silent about a movement inspired by our example. So when I hear people say, "Oh, we're in Ukraine to fight for democracy," I don't believe it. Because in the end, what we're really interested in is the extension of our influence throughout the world and in the region. And here we have a president of the United States who has criminalized political dissent, has attempted to prosecute his main political opponent in the United States and put him in prison. And we're talking about defending democracy abroad, when it looks like, even by outside observers of the United States, that we are abandoning the whole idea of democracy, due process, and a healthy two-party system at home. We even blew up the Nord Stream pipeline from Russia to Germany as a way of undermining the Russian economy. Why do we want to hurt Russia? Why do we not think that they have legitimate interests? They're a country. And as long as their interests or actions don't threaten us, why do we feel the need to interfere in their affairs? It has been openly stated that the objective of the Ukrainian war, which has resulted, by the way, in the death of about 350,000 Ukrainians, is to destabilize Russia and see if they cannot find a replacement for Putin. What are we to do? Well, we need to do something very drastic. I think Trump attempted to do this, but we need to make the shift complete. The U.S. foreign policy has been on a singular track since the end of the Second World War. And as Eisenhower warned in 1961, the military-industrial complex would eventually influence our foreign policy to an insidious degree, to where they would begin to put profits ahead of peace. And that's what's happened. The United States does not need to be the global hegemony. It needs to be true to itself. People talk about American exceptionalism, but America's exceptionalism has never been in its power. There have been many great empires throughout history, and one's now. Its exceptionalism is in its founding. In these words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And it's time for the United States to regain its own moral center in the world, especially for its own citizens, who right now need it to be involved in their lives more than in the lives of the people in the Ukraine or, frankly, anywhere else. Thank you for listening.